And we are back, folks, here on the latest installment of the MCU Rewatch Review series with the doc, Chris Mueller from Bleacher Report. Chris, welcome back. Today we're talking about Thor.
I'm looking forward to it.
Now, you left me with a cliffhanger the last time we chatted because you said that it was maybe not one of your favorite movies, but it was a movie that you actually liked more than most fans, correct?
Yes, I enjoy the first Thor movie, and I think it's probably a little underrated.
Underrated. Okay, so we'll get into that. Would you say that this is a movie, well, you said you like it more than most for a majority of Marvel fans. Do you think for a majority of MCU fans, this kind of ranks lower on the list of, must-see best MCU movies to date?
Yeah, I think a lot of people automatically will tell you Thor 3 is the best Thor, and it is probably the best Thor. But there's something about the first movie that I feel like if you're going to get into the MCU, you need to see it because it was kind of the first of its kind in the MCU because it was almost completely CGI sets, whereas a lot of the stuff up until this point had been practical with just digital effects added in for like the fancy Iron Man suit or whatever. But here it's like Asgard was 100% created digitally except for a few sets, so it was really pushing the boundaries of digital effects at the time.
I didn't even really think about that. I was thinking more about, story-based too. That's a great point. I was thinking more about how the last three movies that we've talked about, Iron Man 2, and Hulk, have all been kind of based not just on Earth, but more realistic stories, maybe not, specifically with Hulk, as we talked about previously. But this is the first one of the MCU movies to really kind of go beyond that realm, explore different mythologies, and it was definitely different, for lack of a better term, than everything else in the MCU up to this point. Did you think that was maybe not for you specifically, for you personally, but do you think for MCU fans that weren't, following the comics, weren't familiar overly with Thor, that was kind of a turnoff that it wasn't the same, or do you think it kind of benefited from being unique from the other movies up to this point?
Well, I think it benefited because it introduced a new side of the world, because even with Hulk being as crazy as it is, like Hulk and the first two Iron Mans felt like they were in our world. And this is the first time where it's like, okay, we're going cosmic, we're introducing the concept of all these other societies living out in space, and the fact that all these gods were actually based on these people from this other planet who are technically aliens. And like they couldn't have gotten a better cast for one. I mean, like the cast for this movie, if you look at it, like is absolutely loaded.
It's especially in comparison to with some of the other movies too. I mean, Iron Man 2, as we talked about on the last episode, had a lot of star power included. Do you think that was done on purpose? Because I look at Thor, and when I remember when it first came out, I wasn't really in love with the movie. I've watched it back a few times since then, and I've grown to appreciate it more and like it more. I completely agree. I don't know if I would go so far as to call it underrated, but it definitely is not as bad as, people have made it out to be, as I've made it out to be in the past. I was kind of bored the first time I watched it, but, kind of going back and rewatching it and whatnot, which is the whole purpose of this podcast and, reviewing these movies again, is that, I don't know, it was entertaining. The cast, I think, was a big part of that. So do you think they loaded up this movie with the star power to kind of, convince people to give it a shot and to go see the movie?
I mean, I think when it comes to Chris Hemsworth, he was sort of unknown at the time, but the cast is more like, I wouldn't say it was a bunch of A-list actors thrown together. It was more like a group of good actors being put into a crazy comic book movie. So you have Natalie Portman, who's an Oscar winner. You have Tom Hiddleston, who's basically like a trained theater actor, I think. Stellan Skarsgård, who's been around forever and done a million great things. Colm Feore, Ray Stevenson, Idris Elba, Kat Dennings, Rene Russo. Like, it's Anthony Hopkins. You can't really pick a bad cast member in this movie, and they all come from different backgrounds, and it's all these recognizable people from all these other things that you've seen, but other than maybe Portman and Hopkins, not a lot of them would be considered main characters in most of their other appearances.
You mentioned how Hemsworth wasn't really as well known prior to Thor. Would you consider this his breakout role?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this made him a huge star worldwide.
Mm-hmm. And now he's in that Netflix movie Extraction I saw the other day. I didn't watch the movie, but I saw that he's in it, and I think Drew McIntyre actually interviewed him for the WWE YouTube channel, which was incredibly random. But he's in all this other stuff now, which is cool. And I really enjoy Hemsworth, so it's cool to see. But you mentioned Natalie Portman. I think of all the people in this movie, and everyone plays their roles so remarkably well, which we'll get into, Hemsworth stands out. I think he does a really good job as Thor, especially as the movies progress, which I'll also mention in a second. But Natalie Portman as Jane Foster, of the movies that we watched up to this point, there's really not a lot of people to go off of, but from Betty and Hulk, and then Pepper Potts in the Iron Man movies, I think Jane Foster is easily, in my opinion, the most likable love interest of any of the superheroes up to this point, and probably, after having already watched Captain America, which we'll get to in our next episode. I guess Peggy Carter's likable too. But it seems like Jane Foster, Natalie Portman as Jane Foster, is very relatable, and she might have been the perfect person for that role.
Yeah, I mean, most people, I think, like Natalie Portman for at least one thing that she's done, because she's had a pretty varied career.
Mm-hmm.
But she was definitely a strong actress to choose, and because of that, it brought more attention to the role. I think if you had just cast a B or C-list actress that from some sitcom or something, the role probably wouldn't have been as significant. I think having Natalie Portman there kind of forced them to make that role important and make her more than... Because she's not just the girl he likes. Like, she's a scientist. She's doing her own thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the fact that she has her... Like, she's got agency in this movie, and I think that was important for Natalie Portman to even take the role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think she does overall. They kind of portray her very well in just the way that she... maybe not knocks it out of the park, but yeah, like you said, I think you hit it right on the nail. You hit the nail right on the head there when you said about how, she's more than just, I put it love interest, but like you said, she's a scientist and a very integral part to the story here of this entire movie. I don't know if you mentioned her name when you were running down the list of celebrities in this movie. What's the name of the woman who plays Darcy the friend? I think she's from that show Two Broke Girls or something like that.
Kat Dennings.
Kat Dennings, correct. Was she in the second movie? I mean, I know we'll get to that, but was she in the second Thor movie or no?
Yeah, because she had that, she had her own intern who she also was, making out with in the final battle.
I completely forgot about that. This is why I got to go back and rewatch the movies. But I thought she played her role well as the comedic relief. I think they're bringing her back for another show, like the Winter Soldier show. Have you heard anything about that?
I heard she was coming back for something, but I assumed it would be Thor with Natalie Portman, the Love and Thunder movie that they're going to do. I assumed that would probably be, but it wouldn't surprise me if she was going to be in one of the Disney Plus series as well, just because it seems like those shows are going to use a lot of those side characters to make it feel more connected.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to have Chris Evans in every episode of this show, or any of them probably. Maybe he'll do a cameo as Old Man Steve at the end or something, but yeah, you're going to need these other characters like Don Cheadle or Falcon, or not Falcon, he's one of the stars, just anybody who can connect you to the other movies. I wouldn't be surprised if Benedict Wong's character from Doctor Strange shows up in one of these series just randomly for a cameo because they happen to be in New York,
Yeah, no, I think that'd be cool. I know this is off topic, but do you think with the upcoming Disney Plus shows that they're gonna be, with the star power that they're loading them up with between, Bucky and they have Falcon and all these other people, and Wanda and Vision having their own show, do you think that they're doing that to kind of, not doing it on purpose, but do you think that's their way of kind of saying, hey, these shows are going to be more significant than Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., or I don't really watch any of the other Marvel movies. I know there's the Agent Carter show. I don't watch any of the other shows. I mean, do you think they're doing that to say, hey, listen, these are going to be part of the canon when these other shows technically may not, because we don't really acknowledge them with the MCU?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. Up until the announcement of the Disney Plus stuff, Marvel TV was, I believe, run by Jeff Loeb. and it was kind of a separate division from Marvel movies, which was Kevin Feige's thing.
Mm-hmm.
So even though they were sort of connected, there was a little bit of a disconnect there. So all the Netflix stuff or the Hulu stuff, like was it Cloak and Dagger, they reference stuff in the MCU, but it's not considered part of the overall MCU storyline. These new shows are supposed to be like movie budgets and technically be part of it. Mm-hmm. So even though Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the beginning was, now they're at a point where they're doing stuff completely separate from the movies and not even worrying about it.
Yeah, that's the way that they kind of seem, from what I've seen from the shows, that they're going about it. Would you recommend the shows for someone like me who's seen all the movies but none of the shows up to this point?
I mean, I like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for what it is on its own. Like, even though it's got some of the Marvel connections, like Clark Gregg is just great in his role, and it's got a good cast of other side characters. The first season is a little rocky for the first half of it, and then once you start to get into the stuff where the Winter Soldier affected S.H.I.E.L.D., the show becomes much more interesting and serialized instead of each episode kind of having its own villain.
Yeah.
So you start to get these longer story arcs, but the Netflix shows, I really enjoyed most of them. Iron Fist was like, so-so, but Jessica Jones, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Punisher, those were all quality shows that I would definitely recommend, especially Daredevil. That was an amazing show.
They're all still on Netflix, right? They're not on Disney Plus?
Right, because they were Netflix produced, so they'll always be on Netflix. They're Netflix originals that were produced in conjunction with Marvel.
Gotcha.
And I guess even though Netflix had the option to continue the shows, they've all since been canceled, and part of that probably has to do with the rising budgets as shows continue to go and whatnot. But supposedly the rule was Marvel could use those same characters again after 2 years of the shows being over. So Daredevil is about to come up on the 2-year mark, because I think he was one of the first ones to be done. And there's rumors that Charlie Cox might actually return to play the character in the movies or possibly a Disney Plus series at some point, which would be awesome because he was very good in that role.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I've never heard that up, until now, that they would have to wait 2 years to use the characters again. I think that'd be cool. I think it was, not a majority of people, but I think some people were hoping for maybe a mention or a cameo of some of the Netflix characters in the Endgame movie when they did this massive, crossover with everyone involved. I think, that would be an option.
Even the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. characters, a lot of people held out hope that maybe Coulson would be there. But
yes, yeah. Or even
just because he was in Captain Marvel, I think a lot of people were like, "Oh, well, if he's in Captain Marvel, then obviously he's going to be in one of these Avengers movies too," and it just never happened.
I mean, again, random side note, but do you think they didn't have him show up at that last scene in Endgame when they show it's that one shot, continuous shot of everyone by the lake for Tony's funeral, and you see Fury, you see everyone else, you see the kid from Iron Man 3, for God's sakes. Some people were saying maybe they could have shown Coulson, but I feel like for people who don't watch the movies, they probably still think
there's a reason why he's not there. I mean, I could spoil it, but
is it from the show?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't spoil it, because I do want to watch the show at some point. So I'll leave me hanging there. But I did not know that. I thought they might have done that because he was,
Anyone who watches the show knows why Coulson wasn't at the funeral or in the movie.
Okay. Good. That's a good incentive to watch the show then, because now I want to go watch the show after you had said that. But back to Thor.
I would say season 2 of that show is the best season.
How many seasons are there?
Me. Like 7.
Jesus. How long is each episode?
It's an hour show, so 44 minutes, 42 minutes without commercials, roughly around that range.
Do you know how many episodes are in a season or no?
It's the kind of show that goes 22, but I think the last couple seasons have been shorter because of the budget being lowered a little bit. And they knew that this last season was going to be their last, so I'm sure they set it up to finish. I don't think the last season has actually started airing yet.
Yeah, okay. And that's on Netflix, right? That they would be airing the last season of the show for Agents of
No,
S.H.I.E.L.D.?
it's ABC.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm going to have to check it out. That's going to take a long time for me to get through. I can't, it's harder for me to do like the 7 season shows that are a lot longer, like Breaking Bad and stuff like that. But if the shows are good enough, I'll find the time. But I'll have to do that with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. if you recommend it. But what'd you say?
I
Season
mean,
2 is the best
I
one?
would warn you that the first half of the first season can be a little. It's villain of the week. You're still getting to know these characters that are like all new creations, not from the comics for the most part, except for one. So it is a little slow moving and that, but like if you make it all the way through the first season, you'll know if you want to keep going.
Okay. All right. I'll have to check them out. So I've always wanted to because I've heard good things about the show, at least, early on and whatever. Like you said, season 2 was arguably the best, you said, right? Okay. So, nice. I'll have to check that out.
But were you ever into the Netflix ones, like Daredevil or anything?
No, that's the thing. I've never seen any of them. I've only heard of them. I have yet to watch any of them. But Daredevil would probably be number one,
I would
right?
watch Daredevil first. It's probably the best of the Marvel shows. And it's only 3 seasons, and each season's only 13 episodes.
I would probably go through that one first because it's a lot shorter. So, and I've, people have tried to get me to watch the show in the past. I just was never able to. I still have to watch Stranger Things. That's still on my things to watch. Things to watch too, and that's like 3 seasons in or whatever. But I'll definitely have to check out Daredevil at some point if it's that good. Like you said, it's probably the best of that bunch, right? Of the Marvel Netflix shows.
In my opinion, it is. I could see why some people would make the argument for Luke Cage or Jessica Jones because they're completely different types of shows. Like Daredevil is very much a martial arts show. Okay. And Luke Cage is more of like the standard strong, invincible superhero stuff, whereas Jessica Jones is much more cerebral. Like it's very dramatic and a lot less punchy.
Okay. I guess it's really whatever your preference is. I'm willing to watch it all.
But they're all great shows with like the perfect casting choices. I mean, Kristen Ritter as Jessica Jones is outstanding.
Mm-hmm. And you said they're all canceled at this point?
Yeah, unfortunately.
All right, I'm going to have to go check those out. Probably, if you had to say in order what shows I should watch, Daredevil being 1, probably Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. being 2, right? In order of like importance.
Yeah, probably. But like the thing with the Netflix stuff is you sort of want to watch them all in the order that the seasons were released because they do connect to each other slightly.
Oh, okay. All right.
I mean, you can probably skip Iron Fist and get the gist of him because they did a show called The Defenders, which was all 4 of those characters teaming up together like an Avengers movie.
Mm-hmm.
So The Defenders takes place after 2 seasons of Daredevil and a season each of Jessica Jones, Iron Fist, and Luke Cage.
Oh, okay. All right. That's not too bad.
So it's I would look up the order of how all the seasons came out and then watch it in that order.
Yeah.
You'll get a much better experience out of it.
Yeah, no, I would probably enjoy it more if it's, chronologically.
And they reference the MCU. They talk about like the invasion in the Avengers, like it has lasting effects in New York. Like the first season of Daredevil, like they're constantly talking about how the city is under construction from
the first movie.
Of the Avengers.
Yeah. Interesting. I'll have to check it out then. Now I'm more open to watching it now that you had said that. And I mean, it's a little confusing with what you have to watch first, but again, there's so many people out there who have it all written down in terms of, I'll watch this before you watch that. I'm sure it can't be too difficult, so I will definitely check that out. Yeah. As we go along further here with Thor, how familiar were you with the character before you went to go see the movie, and what was your anticipation level going in?
I didn't know anything about him as far as comics go, but I knew of the Thor, like the actual Thor mythology, and then I had seen the made-for-TV movie with the Lou Ferrigno Hulk and their version of Thor, which was way different from Thor in the movie.
Yeah.
So that's like, you can't even like consider them the same character almost, but I went into it basically just like expecting it to be much more sci-fi, and I was right.
Yeah, there was a lot of sci-fi here. I thought they did a good job opening up the movie with, well, first of all, it was a flashback scene. They open up with, Jane Foster finding Thor after they hit him with a car and whatever, which was great with Dr. Selvig and Darcy and whatever. And then they do the flashback for, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes. It's not a quick flashback. It's everything leading up to that point with Thor, the invasion and everything else, and before he's about to be crowned at the very beginning of the movie. So, what were your thoughts on the origins of Thor being explored in the first, I don't know, I would say not even, maybe quarter of this movie, kind of introducing people to what Thor was all about, who he was, and why you should care about him?
Well, I thought they did a good job setting you up on Earth first. I felt like that was probably important to make it clear that this was the same world that we already knew from Iron Man and Hulk. Mm. And then going on to Asgard was just, it's, like I said, it's the first completely CGI world that they have done at this point. So it was just visually, it was really cool. And then I think the thing that surprised me the most was how funny the movie was. I thought Chris Hemsworth did a great job being kind of just a genuinely funny meathead. Because Thor's not the smartest guy in the room. He knows it. He knows that he's there because he's the muscle. And the fact that he's, super cocky in the beginning of the movie allows him to obviously learn a lesson about sacrifice by the end. But I just felt like they struck such a good tone of serious and humorous in this one.
I don't think that gets talked about enough just because of how funny Ragnarok was. And how, I think that's a lot funnier, but this does, this is the whole purpose of why we're doing this, to kind of go back and realize how good some of these movies are and appreciate them for what they are. But no, I definitely agree. If you had to pick one, maybe not a one-liner, but one funny moment involving Thor in this movie, what would it be? Because for me, it's probably the scene when they're at the cafe or whatever, and he takes the glass and he just throws it on the ground as if he was back in, Asgard, and he just screams, "Another!" I thought that was awesome. And then Jane's like, "What the hell are you doing, dude? Can you have manners or whatever?" That was my favorite moment, but what about yours?
I think the part that made me laugh the hardest in the theater when I watched this one was the second time she hit him with a vehicle.
When was the second time?
She's literally in the hospital parking lot, and he had figured out how to get out of his restraints, and he's just walking, and she smacks into him again, and she's like, "I swear to God, I'm not doing this on purpose."
Yeah, that was cool.
That was great. But then, there's so many funny scenes, and Tom Hiddleston as Loki, he's a very sinister villain, but at the same time, he's so charming and witty that you can't help but find that character funny too.
Yeah, I think watching the first half of the movie, I'm not, for the first time, I'm like, oh, how, the whole mythology aspect of the movie, I'm not a big fan of. I'm not too into that stuff. But I think as they go along, they kind of humanize a lot of the characters. Loki has a lot of personality. They explore that more in future movies, specifically the first Avengers, which we'll get to eventually. But definitely Thor. Do you think, as the movie progresses, and I think they kind of fix this issue by Ragnarok years later, do you think early on when they first show him, he kind of comes across as a bit one-dimensional as a character? Like you said, the big meathead, wanting, kind of overconfident in his abilities and all this other stuff. Do you think they kind of solve that by the end of the movie? Do you think he came across as one-dimensional at all?
Well, I never thought he was very one-dimensional to begin with. I think all characters start off simple, and then you make them more complicated over time.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe for the comic book fans who had known 60 years of Thor mythology from the comics going into it, he might have seemed a little simple. But to me, it was a good idea to start him off as a brash, arrogant guy, because obviously that works for the hero storyline of learning humility and sacrifice later on. But I also liked that it was almost like a Shakespearean family drama with the father casting out the son in order to prove himself, and the more jealous son in the background scheming. There was just a lot of that kind of stuff where it felt like a slightly more complex story than maybe the first Iron Man. or the first Hulk.
Do you think that's where, I mean, when you first saw the movie at the very beginning, when they kind of run through the story, Laufey is how you pronounce the main antagonist name, right? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Laufey?
Laufey, something like that.
Laufey,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, they said it a million times in the movie, but I can never get it straight. But anyway, so when you were first watching this movie, do you think, okay, Loki's going to be the one to overthrow the father, even though Laufey was like the main antagonist in the movie, the whatever. I want to say the Iron Giant. What were they called again? This is how far removed I am from the Thor stuff.
The Ice Giants?
The Ice Giants. Okay, so they show Laufey.
The Frost Giants.
The Frost Giants. I'm sorry, you're right. The Frost Giants. So they show him, and he's supposed to be the big bad of this movie. Did you kind of expect from the beginning that Loki? Okay, I could see where this is going. He's going to try to take his father's place and spite his brother. Blah blah blah.
Well, I mean, anyone who knows anything about the character of Loki from Norse mythology probably knew he was going to turn on everybody anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's like, he's the trickster god. He's a dickhead, basically. But, I mean, I felt like having a secondary antagonist was good because anyone who didn't suspect that may have actually been caught off guard by the reveal that Loki was bad. But I think they set it up pretty obvious in the beginning that Loki was the real villain.
Was the big reveal, not even at the end, but like, I don't know, early on, halfway through, that he was Laufey's son, that he was, actually related to Laufey and he was one of the Frost Giants and whatever. Was that in the comics, or was that something they made in it for the movie?
I believe that's something they just did for the movie. I could be wrong, but I think he was originally actually Odin's son.
Okay.
In the comics. So I'm not 100% sure on that, though. I just know that, that reveal did catch me a little off guard because, obviously, you expect a Frost Giant to look like a Frost Giant, and he looks like a human or an Asgardian, I guess.
Well, yeah, for me, I mean, I had seen, I think, the Avengers before I had seen this movie and all the other sequels and whatnot. This is something, for better or for worse, and I'm going to get your thoughts on it, that they never acknowledge again. You would think from watching all the other Thor movies and, Avengers and whatever, that Loki actually is Thor's brother and that Odin actually is his father. But they never really delve into that again in any other movie after this one.
Well, in the Avengers, Thor has that line about how he's an adopted brother.
Oh, right. Okay. I forgot about that. This is why we got to get to that movie so I can remember that line. But he does mention that. Yeah. I forgot about that. So this is another thing I had to clarify with you. So at the very beginning of the movie, Odin says to Thor, like literally in the opening scene when he goes, "Thor, my firstborn." He's not his firstborn, right? Isn't it the sister from Ragnarok, Hela?
Well, yeah, but at that point he's hiding Hela from everybody, and in the comics, Hela is not Odin's daughter.
Okay, that was something they made up for the movie.
So, yeah, so that in itself may have not even been something they were planning on at that point. Like, this is still all pre-Avengers 1. I mean, they don't know how far the MCU is going to go when they're making the first Thor, so that's one of those lines that, like, you can just attribute it to the fact that he had been hiding her, but really in reality they just never planned on having anybody else.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I figured, X amount of years out, this movie came out in early 2011, I believe. I think it was May of 2011. Ragnarok didn't come out until late 2017, so I'm sure they didn't plan for that, many years out. But I just thought that was interesting. So anyway, two more things from the movie as well. When they were trying to pick up the hammer scene, I thought that was great. Kind of gave me vibes of the sword and the stone when they're trying to take the hammer off the ground. That's what it kind of reminded me of. I'm not sure if that was the inspiration for the scene or not, but that was cool. We got the Stan Lee cameo at that part when he has, the bed of his truck ripped off when he's trying to drag it away, which was cool. Made for a nice running gag up until they eventually, Thor, picks it up and whatever at the end of the movie. With Thor and Jane, one thing I kind of got from this movie, and again, this might be just me, one takeaway that I had, was that it feels like they kind of fall for each other a little too easily, just because, she hits him and whatever, but like early on, they have a lot of animosity, and I know this is kind of the way a lot of romantic movies, romance movies kind of go. But was it just me, or do you think it was a little rushed in terms of how? Because it seems like in one scene she wants nothing to do with him, and then they're kind of just friends, or she just wants to help him, or she's fascinated in where he came from and whatever, to then kind of just her outright falling for him a little later on in the movie.
Yeah, I mean that's movie romance for you. It's the fact that they were going to fall in love was like kind of just already in the cards, so it doesn't feel like they tried to make that too original of a story. But it's just weird to me how at the end of this movie they act like it would be so hard for him to go back to Earth and see her, and then he's just constantly back on Earth after that. That was one of those weird things where I feel like they wrote themselves into a corner and just decided to ignore it.
That's what I was going to ask you at the end, because it's at the very end of the movie, but we might as well bring it up now because you just acknowledged it. Dude, that makes no sense. So, again, I had watched the movies out of order initially, and now we're watching them in order. But, like, you see Thor with ease. I know they reference it, I believe, in Avengers, but literally, like, they make a big deal. The whole sacrifice in the movie is that he can't go back to Earth, and that's why he did what he did. Yet he's right back on Earth literally a year later in Avengers. Like, do you think... it kind of reminds me in a lot of ways of Rise of Skywalker, how they make a lot of different sacrifices, and then none of them mean anything because they kind of go back on them, later on in the movie. It kind of feels that way here with Thor when they destroy the bridge, and then he goes right back to Earth, like in the very next movie, and they continue their relationship like nothing ever happened. Again, it's not something that bothers you in the moment when you're watching the movie a decade ago because you didn't know what would happen. But in retrospect, do you think that was kind of a dumb ending for this movie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was probably one of those decisions that they just didn't think too hard about, because it's like, oh yeah, that's a beautiful ending. He's sacrificing the ability to see her, and then it's like, in the Avengers, there's a throwaway line where Loki says like, oh, how much dark magic did he have to conjure to send you here? Mm-hmm. And then by Thor 2, the Bifrost is just rebuilt, and nobody talks about the fact that it was destroyed.
Yeah.
It was like, had there only ever been one Thor movie, sure, would have worked fine.
That would have worked perfectly. Do you think it's one of those things where, like, I can't imagine Marvel didn't get involved here. I feel like they made the movie for themselves, like, oh, we're going to make this our own isolated movie. And then Marvel's like, no, we have our own plans with Thor. We got to have him back on Earth for Avengers. This is what we're going to do. Do you feel like it might be a clash of heads here between the people at Marvel and the people who made Thor?
Well, I think by this point, the MCU being established was already a priority. That's why Coulson had such a big part in this.
Sure.
But, I mean, at this point, I don't know if... Was this one produced by... Yeah, this was another Paramount. So this was still before Disney stepped in.
When did Disney step in?
I feel like... I think... I want to say Disney was involved, like, as of the first Avengers.
Okay, that's what I was going to say, yeah. Yeah, maybe that has something to do with it.
Might have been Captain America, I don't know.
Yeah, well, Captain America came out a couple months before, or after this, I'm sorry, so it was either that one or Avengers, but, yeah, no, I don't know, it just kind of seemed a little strange that they would do that. But, no, you make a good point there. They obviously have a lot of ties to the MCU. In this movie, we see a lot of different people. We see Sitwell, who we mentioned, I think, in one of our other reviews. He makes an appearance in this movie. Briefly, but he's in it for more than a couple seconds. We see him, Hawkeye's big debut, which I'll get to in a second. But you mentioned Coulson, who plays a very big role in this movie. Again, maybe this was just me. Why does S.H.I.E.L.D., for most of this movie, come across as so incompetent? Like, for example, when they got the hammer isolated, Thor goes after it, they find Thor, and then they're going after him, and he just destroys everyone. I know Thor is supposed to be the superhuman being and whatnot, but they kind of paint him out to be the bad guy for most of this movie, stealing, Jane Foster's equipment early on, and then they're just so easily disposed of until at the very end when Thor and the S.H.I.E.L.D. Come together.
Well, I think part of the implication is that Coulson is letting some of this stuff happen because he's curious.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Because there's the part when Hawkeye gets in this little crow's nest thing and he has a shot, but Coulson tells him to hold off because he wants to know what happens with the hammer.
Yes, yeah, that scene too, yeah.
And then they also, I mean, yeah, the agents getting mowed down, you can just attribute that to the fact that Thor is a superhero. But it didn't feel to me like S.H.I.E.L.D. was necessarily incompetent. I also just felt like at this point, they didn't know how important S.H.I.E.L.D. was going to be to the overall story, so they were basically just portraying them as just any other government agency with an acronym.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
like by the time the Avengers rolled around, S.H.I.E.L.D. was this, all-powerful world
exactly
protecting organization. But yeah, I feel like some of that was Coulson letting it happen because he was curious to see what Thor would do.
Yeah, and I just thought it was an odd dynamic for most of it. And I had another question for you. Oh, so with Hawkeye, so do they ever explain why? Because when they first introduced Hawkeye, obviously he's very skilled. He's very skilled with the arrows. But to a common fan, when you're watching this and you see him for the first time, and you see all these array of weapons, including guns and whatnot, and then he goes for the arrow, which obviously I don't think would be as effective. Did they ever explain why he goes in the movies? Because I know obviously they do in the comics. Did they ever explain why he prefers the arrow over the gun? I feel like that's never explained at any point.
I feel like it's just a personal preference thing. I mean, yeah, in reality, bullets would be much more effective, but they give it the excuse that, like, he's got trick arrows that give him all these different uses and blah, 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 but it's just a cool thing of, he's the cool archer, like how the Green Arrow is for DC. He's got his gimmick, and that's what makes him stand out from everybody. If he just grabbed a gun, it could just be any agent.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I just thought they might explain why or like the backstory there. Maybe they will with the upcoming Black Widow movie if he's in it. I'm not sure. But yeah, speaking of Black Widow, what I was going to say was that I thought, as we talked about in our Iron Man 2 review, she had a really good debut. They introduced their character very well. Hawkeye, not to say that his debut here was lackluster by any means. I thought he came across very well. The issue, I think, is that with everything else going on, you had Coulson, you had all the other stars that you mentioned at the start of this review. Do you feel like Hawkeye's debut, because he's supposed to be by Avengers, I mean, maybe not one of the main Avengers, because, there's everyone else that's much more powerful than him. Do you think his debut here kind of comes across as an afterthought?
Wait, I'm sorry, explain that again. Do I think whose comes across as an afterthought?
Hawkeye's debut. And, kind of compared to Black Widow's, how she was such a big part of Iron Man 2,
Easter egg. I think that was more of an Easter egg for anything else. Like, they might not have even known if the Avengers was going to fully form at this point.
Okay.
So introducing Hawkeye was, I think, an insurance for, like, yeah, now we have this other character that we don't have to make a whole separate movie for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that would make sense, because he's not all that important by the beginning of Avengers. He's actually working with Loki under the mind control thing, so I guess that would make sense. But did you appreciate the Donald Blake reference in this movie halfway through?
Yeah, I had forgotten all about the fact that he had an alter ego, and that was part of the original TV movie that I had seen too, but I think that was one of those things that I didn't put together until somebody had pointed it out to me, like, oh yeah, the alter ego from the comics, that's the fake ID that he uses, or the boyfriend's ID, or whatever it is.
Mm. Yeah, and I thought that was a cool Easter egg. So with Thor, one of the big things about the movie that we come to find out by the end, I mean, he's struggling on Earth to find out whether he's worthy or not, because he goes to the hammer, he can't pick it up, and then he eventually summons the hammer and he's worthy. But is he actually worthy, though? Because we come to find out by Ragnarok that it's not really the power of the hammer, but it's kind of within him, and he doesn't really come to that conclusion until that movie, and it kind of follows similar patterns in that respect. Do you think by the end of this movie Thor actually is worthy of wielding the hammer, or is it just kind of I don't know, a minor bump in the road for him, or what have you?
Well, yeah, I mean, the fact that he proves he's willing to sacrifice himself, like, at that point, he's sort of leveled down to being a human. Mm-hmm. So when he walks up to the big juggernaut thing that's coming through town, he basically, like, thinks that thing is going to kill him, but that once it does, the rampage will stop. So I think, like, that act in and of itself is what made him worthy in the eyes of his father's magic, or whatever it is.
I think that story was obviously the centerpiece of this movie, but I think, at least in my opinion, from watching it, and you talked about it earlier, how with the story with Loki and him being kind of overshadowed by Thor and him wanting to kind of take the throne and, over his father and whatever, overthrow his father, and kind of his own redemption story in a way, where you kind of feel bad for him because he didn't know that he was Laufey's son, and then he comes to find that out, and he kind of feels that secrets are being, withheld from him and stuff like that. Do you think this movie is more of, I know it's Thor and whatever, and he's all over the movie, but I feel this is just as much of an origin story and about Loki as it is Thor?
Absolutely, and I think that's part of what I was talking about, the Shakespearean stuff earlier, is the fact that, like, this jealous son finds out that he's actually been lied to his entire life, and in a lot of ways is entirely justified in most of his feelings. It's just the way he goes about getting what he wants is what makes him a villain. But, like, had this movie been told from his perspective, you could view him as the hero.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
Really his, like, and Hela even makes the point later on, like, Thor and Loki's father, Odin, he used to be like a marauding conqueror.
Yep.
Before deciding to declare peace for whatever reason. And if that character is the one we had gotten to know, then you would have been rooting for Loki to overthrow him. So it's one of those things where it's like, most of those tragic stories, you could view either character as being in the right, but the movie frames it as Thor is good, Loki is bad, because that's the simple way to look at it. But yeah, Loki's a very complicated character, and that's why I think he became so popular, in addition to Tom Hiddleston's performance just being awesome.
Yeah, that's what I really liked about, this movie with Thor and Loki, is that it's not, like you said, Thor is good, Loki is bad, but there are many ways where it really isn't as black and white as that, because like you said, Loki's a very complicated character. The further along we go, not only in this movie, but in the MCU, you kind of feel more and more for Loki, and obviously as the god of mischief and, turning having more face and heel turns than the Big Show, you want to root for the guy as much as, as you possibly can by the end of the MCU. But, I thought that was cool. And, you see Loki far more often in this movie than you do Laufey. And I think he's kind of supposed to be the big bad guy. He's more of the, through and through villain in this movie than Loki is. But I feel like compared to everyone else, even up to this point, even Abomination was kind of one-dimensional, but I think Laufey really takes the cake as probably one of the weakest villains they've ever had. Not to mention that he's betrayed so easily by Loki, in the third act. And then that's it. He just dies at the hands of Loki, and then we never see him again. Do you think, and not that that's the worst part of the movie or whatever, and that was probably done by design, but do you think that Laufey deserves, among top billing as one of the weakest MCU villains in the entire saga?
He's definitely a weak villain, but I don't think he was designed to be a strong villain. He was always designed to be Loki's fall guy. That was Loki's plan from the beginning, was to use him for a fake invasion so he could look like a hero for saving his father. That was his plan.
Okay, yeah. Yeah,
it would have worked had Thor not been able to return home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's what I like about the movie, where Loki isn't through and through the bad guy. He has evil intentions at a certain point, but you kind of feel bad for him. He makes the ultimate sacrifice at the end, although we come to find out in the post-credit scene that he's still alive, which I'm going to ask you about now. So they show, which is obviously planned to, designed to plant the seeds for the Avengers the following year, when they show Selvig, interacting with Nick Fury, and it kind of leads into what we would see in the Avengers with the Tesseract and whatnot. So by this point, the Tesseract wasn't really introduced until Captain America, correct? We see it here, but we don't really get the origin story on the Tesseract until Captain America, correct?
Yes, when Red Skull is looking for it is sort of when we figure out what it is.
So they kind of lead into that. They talk about, they kind of lead into Avengers with Selvig trying to work to break down what the Tesseract is all about and whatever. Something I don't really know if it was explained all too well. I know Loki can do a lot of, weird stuff as the god of mischief and whatever. Was it ever explained how he was mind controlling Selvig at the end of the post-credit scene?
Probably the same way he was mind controlling everybody with his little spear.
You mean in the
I mean,
Avengers?
yeah, but like he's magic. I think that's just sort of the explanation that we're supposed to go with, is he learned a lot of magic from his adopted mother, and that's what he's using.
Yeah, that's what I figured, because there was a difference. It might have been the spear thing. I feel like it was more of a magic thing, just because the spear was more of a mind control, and they were more, I don't want to say of a drone, but they were just kind of doing everything they told them to do. Whereas with this scene, it kind of felt like, not that he was Selvig, but he was in his mind, if that makes sense. And maybe it was the spear thing that Thanos gave him, and this kind of takes place after that scene. I don't know. I just thought it was a little confusing, but it did allow you to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Loki's a master of illusion, so it could have been a number of different things, but it was clearly the real Selvig, because that's the one that's in the Avengers as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's more like he's using him as a puppet with the Mind Stone that's in his staff, because we don't know the Mind Stone is in his staff, but that's what he's using.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's probably what it is, and I just think they should have done a better job of explaining that. But again, it's just a post-credit scene, so it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But final thoughts on Thor?
I mean, I like Thor. I think it's a good movie as part of the MCU or just on its own, and I do feel like it's a little underrated in terms of, like, everything that comes after Avengers is pretty highly rated, and I feel like some of the early stuff, like Iron Man 1, Captain America, and Thor, do get a little overlooked because, for one, they were made before the juggernaut Disney got involved, and two, they were done at a time when superhero movies were only just starting to really be taken seriously. So I feel like they're partly responsible, along with the Dark Knight trilogy, with making superhero movies into the big tentpoles that they are now.
Yeah, I think it's worth the rewatch. It's not one of those movies where if you don't watch it, you're going to miss out on a lot, but it does help introduce you to a lot of different characters, specifically Thor. Loki, definitely. I think this movie is must-see for them two alone. Odin's story and how him kind of being weak at various points in the movie would lead to his demise in Ragnarok at the beginning, as well as, you see Sitwell, you see the debut of Hawkeye. Jane Foster will come back, obviously, in the second movie, as well as the upcoming Love and Thunder movie in a few years. So it kind of serves a lot of different purposes, and is definitely worth the rewatch for those reasons alone. But this has been great, Chris. Thanks for help me break down Thor, and the next time we'll be talking about Captain America, the First Avenger.
All right, great.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I'll talk to you soon.